"Turn that off," Daniel Whitmore said sharply, his voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. But there was no music playing, no television humming, nothing but the soft static of the baby monitor on the nightstand, its tiny green light blinking in slow, indifferent rhythm. He stood frozen in the doorway of his bedroom, one hand still gripping the edge of the frame, knuckles pale, breath caught somewhere between his chest and throat as the sound reached him again, faint but unmistakable, a woman's voice drifting through the monitor speaker, low and gentle, carrying a melody that didn't belong in this house anymore. The hallway behind him stretched long and dim, lit only by a single wall sconce casting a weak amber glow across polished hardwood floors that had not heard laughter in months. And yet the sound continued, soft, steady, impossibly familiar. Daniel stepped forward slowly, each footfall measured, as if the floor might betray him if he moved too fast, his heartbeat beginning to sync with the quiet rhythm of the lullaby, a song he hadn't heard since the hospital room, since the machines, since the silence that followed. He reached for the monitor with trembling fingers, adjusting the volume slightly, not because he couldn't hear it, but because some part of him needed to confirm it was real, needed to prove that the sound wasn't just memory bleeding into the present again. On the small screen, the nursery appeared in grainy black and white, the crib centered beneath the window, sheer curtains swaying just slightly from the vent above, and there, seated in the rocking chair beside it, was Amara Lewis, her silhouette calm and still, her head tilted slightly downward as she held Lily close against her shoulder. The baby, who had been crying for nearly an hour, was quiet now, her tiny chest rising and falling in slow, even breaths, one small hand curled loosely against the fabric of Amara's uniform. Daniel's jaw tightened as he watched, his mind refusing to settle, refusing to accept the image in front of him without resistance. Amara had only been in the house for 3 days, another recommendation from an agency that promised warmth and experience, words that meant nothing to him anymore, not after the others had come and gone, each one failing to soothe the endless crying, each one eventually stepping away from the job, with polite apologies and tired eyes. He hadn't expected anything different this time, hadn't even planned to stay home tonight. But Lily's cries had followed him all the way to the driveway, sharp and relentless, pulling him back inside before he could ignore them. And now that voice. It moved through the speaker like something alive, wrapping around the silence of the house, filling spaces that had been hollow for far too long. Daniel swallowed hard, his gaze fixed on the screen as Amara gently shifted in the chair, the wood creaking softly beneath her weight, her voice never breaking, never wavering, as if the song had always belonged to her. "That's not possible," he murmured under his breath, though there was no one there to hear him, no one to answer, only the quiet pulse of the monitor and the sound of that melody threading its way through his chest, pulling at something he had locked away with deliberate care. He pushed himself off the wall and stepped into the hallway, moving toward the nursery with slow, deliberate steps. The closer he got, the clearer the sound became, no longer filtered through static, but real now, present, breathing in the same air he was. The door to the nursery was slightly ajar, a thin line of warm light spilling into the dark corridor, and as he reached it, his hand hovered just inches from the handle, suspended, uncertain, as the final notes of the lullaby lingered in the air. For a moment, he didn't move. For a moment, he simply stood there, listening, his entire world narrowed down to that single, impossible sound, and the quiet, fragile peace it had brought with it. The door creaked open just enough for Daniel to see inside, and the first thing he noticed was not the light or the furniture or even the small figure of his daughter asleep in the crib, but the stillness, the kind that did not belong to this house anymore, the kind that had been missing for months, replaced instead by restless nights and sharp cries that echoed through every hallway like something unresolved. Amara sat in the rocking chair beside the crib, her posture relaxed but attentive, one hand resting lightly on Lily's back, as if she could feel each breath and match it with her own, her voice now barely above a whisper as the last traces of the lullaby faded into the air. Daniel stayed where he was, just inside the doorway, not announcing himself, not interrupting, because something about the moment felt fragile, like glass that might shatter if touched too quickly. He watched the slow rhythm of the chair as it moved back and forth, the soft creak of wood against wood blending with the quiet hum of the wind above. And for the first time in a long time, the house did not feel heavy. It felt suspended, like time had paused without asking permission. Amara adjusted the blanket around Lily with careful precision, tucking it just beneath her chin, her fingers gentle and deliberate. Then she leaned back slightly, her eyes lingering on the child's face to make sure the calm would hold. She did not see Daniel yet, or if she did, she chose not to react, maintaining the same quiet presence that had filled the room since the moment he began listening from the hallway. Daniel's throat tightened as he stepped forward, one slow step onto the soft rug that muted the sound of his movement. But even that small shift felt too loud in his own ears. He cleared his throat softly, not enough to startle, just enough to be noticed. Amara's head turned slightly, her gaze lifting toward him, calm, steady, without surprise or fear, as if she had expected him all along. "She is finally asleep," she said quietly, her voice now stripped of the melody but still carrying that same warmth, the same tone that had reached him through the monitor. Daniel nodded once, his eyes flicking to the crib and then back to her, searching, measuring, trying to reconcile what he had heard with the person in front of him. "What was that song?" he asked, his voice low, controlled, but edged with something he could not quite hide. Amara paused for a brief moment, as if the question itself required thought. Then she glanced down at Lily before answering. "Just something I have always known," she said. "A lullaby." Daniel's jaw tightened again, a subtle shift that did not escape the tension building beneath his composure. "It is not just something," he replied, taking another step into the room, the soft light from the lamp catching the lines on his face, the exhaustion that had settled there over time. "Where did you hear it?" Amara studied him for a second, not defensively, not challengingly, but with a quiet curiosity, as if she could sense that the question carried more weight than the words themselves. "I cannot remember the first time," she said slowly. "It was always there. My grandmother used to hum it when I was a child, and I guess it stayed." The answer hung between them, simple, unembellished, and yet it did nothing to ease the tightness in Daniel's chest. He exhaled through his nose, his gaze drifting briefly back to Lily, who remained still, her small face peaceful in a way he had not seen since before everything changed. The silence that followed was not empty, but full, layered with unspoken thoughts and the faint echo of the melody that still lingered in the room. Daniel shifted his weight slightly, his hand brushing against the edge of the crib as if he needed something solid to ground himself. "That song," he said again, quieter this time, almost to himself. It was hers. Amara did not respond immediately, and that pause, small as it was, seemed to stretch across the room, settling into the quiet like a question neither of them knew how to answer. She looked at Daniel, really looked at him now, past the tailored shirt and the controlled posture, past the authority that usually filled every space he entered, and what she saw instead was something heavier, something worn thin by time and memory. "I did not know," she said softly, her voice careful, almost apologetic, as if she had stepped into something sacred without meaning to. Daniel let out a slow breath, the kind that did not quite release anything, his eyes drifting again to Lily, to the steady rise and fall of her chest, to the peace that had returned to her face like it had been waiting for the right moment to come back. "No one else could get her to sleep," he said, more to the room than to Amara, his voice low and distant, like he was tracing a path through his own thoughts. "Not the nurses, not the specialists, not anyone we brought into this house." His fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the crib, the wood cool beneath his touch, grounding him in a way he did not expect. "She would cry for hours," he continued, the words coming slower now, heavier, as if each one had to pass through something before it could be spoken. "Every night. It did not matter what we tried." Amara listened without interrupting, her posture still, her presence quiet but attentive, the kind of listening that did not rush to fill the silence, but allowed it to exist. "And that song," Daniel said, his voice lowering even more. "It was the only thing that ever worked." The room seemed to shift slightly around that admission, not physically, but emotionally, like something long buried had been brought just close enough to the surface to be felt again. Amara glanced at Lily, then back at Daniel, her brow softening with a kind of understanding that did not need explanation. "Then maybe she remembers," she said gently. Daniel looked at her, his expression tightening, not in anger, but in resistance, as if the idea itself challenged something he had spent months trying to accept. "She is a baby," he replied, though there was less certainty in his voice now. "She does not remember things like that." Amara did not argue, did not push, but there was a quiet steadiness in the way she held her gaze. "Maybe not in the way we do," she said. "But some things stay. The sound of a voice. The feeling of being held. The way someone makes you feel safe." Daniel's jaw shifted slightly, the words landing somewhere deeper than he expected, brushing against memories he had tried to keep contained. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and the only sound in the room was the soft hum of the monitor and the faint whisper of air moving through the vent. Then Daniel straightened slightly, pulling himself back into something more familiar, more controlled, even if it felt thinner now. "Sing it again," he said suddenly, the request coming out before he could fully measure it. Amara blinked once, surprised not by the words, but by the quiet urgency behind them. "Now," she asked softly, glancing at Lily, who remained asleep, undisturbed. Daniel nodded once, his eyes fixed on her, searching, needing something he could not yet name. "Yes," he said, his voice steady but edged with something fragile beneath it. Amara hesitated for just a second, then adjusted her position in the chair, her hand returning to rest lightly against the crib as she drew an slow breath. The room seemed to hold that breath with her, the air still, waiting, as she began again, her voice rising gently into the same melody, soft and unforced, filling the space not with volume, but with presence. Daniel did not move this time. He did not speak. He simply stood there, listening, his shoulders slowly lowering, the tension in his hands easing just slightly as the sound wrapped around him, familiar and impossible all at once, like a memory he could finally touch. The first note left her lips softer than before, almost like she was testing the air, and for a brief second, it felt as though the room itself leaned in to listen, the walls, the furniture, even the quiet glow of the night lamp holding still as the melody began to take shape again. Daniel did not realize he had stopped breathing until his chest tightened, forcing a slow inhale as the sound reached him fully, unfiltered now, no monitor, no distance, just her voice moving gently through the space between them. It was not identical, not perfectly the same as he remembered, but it carried something deeper than imitation, something that did not depend on precision, something that felt lived in. His eyes drifted shut without permission, and suddenly the room was no longer the nursery, no longer the present, but something else entirely, something warmer, brighter, filled with a different kind of light. He could almost see her standing by the window, the late afternoon sun catching in her hair, her voice low as she swayed slightly with a newborn in her arms, humming the same melody with that same quiet certainty, as if the world could not touch them inside that moment. His fingers curled slowly against his palm, the memory pressing in from all sides, not sharp, not painful, but heavy in a way that made it hard to stay standing where he was. He opened his eyes again, the image dissolving as quickly as it had come, replaced by the soft outline of Amara in the chair, her gaze lowered, focused entirely on Lily, unaware of the storm she had stirred just a few feet away. The song continued, each note steady, each breath measured, and Daniel found himself noticing details he had missed before, the slight rasp at the edge of her voice, the way she softened certain words. Even though there were no lyrics, only sound, only feeling. It was not rehearsed. It was not performed. It simply existed, and somehow that made it more unsettling than anything else. He shifted his weight again, slower this time, his shoulder brushing lightly against the doorframe, as if he needed the contact to remind himself where he was. The air in the room felt warmer now, or maybe it was just him, his pulse no longer sharp but uneven, caught somewhere between resistance and surrender. Amara's voice dipped slightly as she reached the end of the phrase, then rose again, looping back into the melody without pause, as if the song did not have a beginning or an end, only a continuous thread that carried itself forward. Daniel's gaze moved from her to Lily, watching the small rise and fall of the blanket, the relaxed curve of her tiny fingers, and something inside him shifted again, quieter this time, less forceful, but just as undeniable. He had spent months trying to control everything, the schedule, the care, the environment, believing that if he could manage every detail, he could somehow protect what remained. But standing there now, listening to something he could not explain, something he had not planned, he felt that control loosen, just enough to let something else in. The song began to slow, the notes stretching slightly longer, softer at the edges, and Amara gently reduced the motion of the chair until it came to a near stop, her hand still resting lightly against the crib. The final note lingered in the air for a brief second before fading completely, leaving behind a silence that did not feel empty, but full, like the echo of something important. Daniel did not speak right away. He did not move. He simply stood there, his gaze fixed on the quiet scene in front of him, his breathing steadying without effort. And for the first time since he had stepped into the hallway, the tightness in his chest eased, not gone, but softened, like a door that had been closed for too long was finally beginning to open. The silence that followed did not feel like an ending. It felt like something waiting, something unfinished, and Daniel realized he was still standing in the same place, his hand resting against the doorframe, his body caught between stepping forward and pulling away. Amara remained seated, her posture unchanged, her attention still on Lily as if the world outside the crib did not require her focus, and that quiet confidence unsettled him more than any argument could have. He cleared his throat softly, the sound small but enough to shift the air between them, and this time she looked up fully, meeting his gaze without hesitation. There was no apology in her expression, no defensiveness, only a calm awareness, as if she understood that whatever had just happened in the room carried weight he had not yet put into words. "You said your grandmother taught you that," Daniel said, his voice lower now, less sharp, but still searching, still trying to anchor something that refused to stay still. Amara nodded once, slow and certain. "Yes, sir," she replied gently. She used to hum it when things were hard. She said it helped people remember how to breathe again. The words settled into him in a way he did not expect, not because they answered his question, but because they touched something deeper than the question itself. He glanced back at Lily, watching the steady rhythm of her sleep, and for a moment, he allowed himself to notice how different she looked now, how her face had softened, how her small body no longer carried that restless tension he had grown used to seeing. "She used to say something similar," he murmured, almost unconsciously, the thought slipping out before he could stop it. Amara did not respond right away, but her gaze shifted slightly, attentive, giving the words space to exist without interruption. Daniel exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just a fraction as the memory surfaced again, not as sharp as before, but clearer somehow, less guarded. "My wife," he added, his voice quieter, more fragile than he intended. "She said music was not about the notes. It was about what people feel when they hear it." The room held that sentence gently, like it understood its importance, and for a brief moment, Daniel felt something inside him loosen, not completely, not all at once, but enough to notice. Amara's expression softened, not with pity, but with recognition, as if she understood the shape of what he was carrying without needing the full story. "She sounds like she knew a lot," Amara said quietly. Daniel let out a faint breath that almost resembled a laugh, though it carried no humor, only memory. "She did," he replied, "more than I ever gave her credit for." The admission lingered in the air, heavier than anything he had said so far, and for a second, he looked away, his gaze settling on the window where the faint outline of the night sky pressed against the glass. The house was still quiet, but it no longer felt empty. It felt different now, as if something had shifted beneath the surface, something subtle but real. Daniel stepped further into the room, this time without hesitation, his hand leaving the doorframe as he moved closer to the crib, stopping just beside it. He looked down at Lily, his expression softer than it had been all night, and without thinking, he reached out, his finger brushing lightly against the edge of the blanket near her hand. She did not stir. She simply continued to sleep, her breathing steady, her small world finally at peace. Daniel swallowed, his throat tightening again, but this time it was not from confusion or resistance. It was something else, something quieter, something that felt dangerously close to relief. He glanced at Amara once more, his eyes no longer searching in the same way, but still holding questions he could not yet form. "Tomorrow," he said slowly, as if testing the words before committing to them, "I want you to show me that song." He paused, then added, softer, almost as if the request surprised even him. From the beginning. The next morning arrived quietly, without urgency, the kind of slow light that crept through the tall windows and settled gently across the polished floors, touching the edges of furniture and softening the sharp lines of a house that had grown too used to silence. Daniel was already awake before the sun fully rose, sitting at the kitchen counter with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, his fingers resting loosely around the mug, as if he had forgotten it was there. He had not slept much, not because of noise or interruption, but because his mind refused to settle, replaying the melody over and over again, not as sound, but as feeling, as something that pressed against him from the inside. The house was different this morning. Not louder, not brighter, but lighter in a way he could not measure, like the weight that had filled every corner had shifted just enough to let something else in. He heard soft footsteps before he saw her, the quiet rhythm of someone moving carefully through a space that was not fully theirs. And when he looked up, Amara was standing near the doorway, her presence calm, her posture steady, as if she carried the same quiet from the night before with her. "Good morning," she said gently, her voice low, careful not to disturb the stillness. Daniel nodded once, setting the mug down with a soft clink against the marble surface. "She slept," he said, not as a question, but as something he needed to confirm out loud. Amara's lips curved slightly, not into a full smile, but into something warmer, more certain. "All night," she replied. Daniel exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just a fraction as the words settled in. Real, undeniable. He pushed himself up from the counter, the movement deliberate, as if he had already decided something before she arrived. "Show me," he said, his voice quieter than usual, but steady. Amara tilted her head slightly, not confused, but attentive, waiting for him to continue. "The song," he added after a brief pause. "From the beginning." For a moment, she did not move, her gaze resting on him with a kind of quiet understanding, as if she knew this was not about the song itself, but about something deeper, something he was not ready to name. Then she nodded once. "All right," she said softly. They moved into the living room, where the morning light stretched wider, filling the space with a gentle glow that reflected off the glass and framed the quiet in something almost peaceful. Amara sat down on the edge of the couch, her hands resting loosely in her lap, and Daniel remained standing for a second longer before lowering himself into the chair across from her, his posture more relaxed than it had been the night before, though there was still a tension beneath it, something unresolved but shifting. The room was still, the kind of stillness that did not feel empty, but expectant, as if even the air was waiting. Amara drew in a slow breath, her eyes lowering slightly, not closing completely, but softening, and then she began. The first note was clearer this time, not quieter, not hidden, but present, filling the space with a gentle certainty that did not demand attention, but earned it. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands loosely clasped together as he listened, really listened, not searching for differences or explanations, but allowing the sound to exist without resistance. The melody unfolded slowly, each note connected, each breath measured, and as it continued, something in his expression changed, not dramatically, not all at once, but subtly, like a surface beginning to reflect light again after being dulled for too long. His gaze drifted downward for a moment, then back up to her, then somewhere beyond, as if the song was pulling his attention through layers he had kept tightly closed. He did not interrupt. He did not question. He simply sat there, letting it happen, his breathing gradually aligning with the rhythm, his shoulders easing without conscious effort. And for the first time since that night in the nursery, he did not feel the need to stop it. The final note faded slowly, lingering just long enough to leave an imprint before dissolving into the quiet. And for a moment, neither of them moved, as if the room itself needed time to settle around what had just passed through it. Daniel remained leaning forward, his hands still loosely clasped, his gaze lowered but unfocused, no longer fixed on Amara, no longer searching for answers, but somewhere deeper, somewhere internal, where the sound had taken root. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, not empty, but full in a way that pressed gently against the edges of his awareness, asking him to stay there a little longer. He inhaled slowly, the breath uneven at first, then steadier, as if his body was adjusting to a rhythm it had forgotten. Amara watched him quietly, her posture unchanged, her presence still grounded, offering no interruption, no attempt to guide what was happening, only space. The morning light had shifted slightly, stretching further across the room, catching the edge of the glass table and reflecting softly against the wall, and Daniel noticed it without fully realizing that he was noticing it, small details returning to him one by one, like senses waking up after being dulled for too long. He let out a quiet breath and leaned back into the chair, his shoulders settling, the tension that had defined his posture now reduced to something faint, something almost unfamiliar. "There is a part in the middle," he said suddenly, his voice low, almost hesitant, as if he was unsure whether the thought belonged to him or to the memory he was touching. Amara tilted her head slightly, attentive, her eyes steady on him. "What part?" she asked softly. Daniel lifted his gaze, not fully meeting hers at first, but close, as if he was still orienting himself. After the second phrase, he said slowly, his brow tightening just a little, "There is a shift. It goes lower, softer. She used to slow down there." His voice trailed slightly at the end, not because he had forgotten, but because the memory carried weight he was still learning how to hold. Amara considered his words for a moment, not correcting, not dismissing, but absorbing them, and then she nodded once, thoughtful. "Like this," she said gently, and without waiting too long, she began again, her voice entering the melody not from the start, but from the place he had described, adjusting the tone, lowering it slightly, softening the edges just enough to follow the shape he had remembered. Daniel's breath caught again, but this time it was different, less abrupt, more like recognition settling into place rather than crashing into it. His eyes lifted fully now, locking onto her with a quiet intensity, not demanding, not accusing, but searching in a new way, not for proof, but for connection. The sound filled the space once more, but it felt more precise now, closer to something he had carried for years, something that had lived in the background of his life until it was suddenly gone. He closed his eyes again, but only for a second, then opened them, grounding himself in the present, in the room, in the person sitting across from him who had somehow reached into a part of his past without ever being there. The song tapered off again, softer this time, and Amara let the final note settle without rushing to fill the silence that followed. Daniel did not speak right away. He looked at her, really looked this time, as if seeing her clearly for the first time, not as an employee, not as someone passing through his home, but as a person carrying something he could not yet explain. His lips parted slightly, then closed again, the words forming and dissolving before they could be spoken, until finally, he exhaled and said quietly, "That is exactly how she sang it." Amara did not react immediately to his words, but something in her expression shifted, not surprise, not pride, but a quiet recognition of the weight behind what he had just said, as if she understood that this was not simply about accuracy, but about something much deeper finding its way back into the room. She lowered her gaze for a brief moment, her hands resting lightly in her lap, her fingers still, as though even the smallest movement might disturb the fragile balance that had formed between them. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, the tension that had once defined every line of his posture now replaced with something more uncertain, more open, though he had not fully realized it yet. He exhaled slowly, his breath steady, and for the first time since the night before, he did not feel the urge to question or control what he did not understand. Instead, he simply sat there, allowing the silence to exist without needing to fill it. "She never wrote it down," he said after a moment, his voice softer now, almost reflective, as if he was speaking more to the memory than to Amara. "I asked her once. I told her she should record it, or at least write it somewhere." His lips pressed together briefly, a faint trace of something like regret passing through his expression. "She said it would not mean the same if it was written, that it only worked if someone carried it." Amara lifted her eyes again, meeting his gaze gently, not intruding, but present. "Maybe she was right," she said quietly. Daniel let out a faint breath that carried a small, almost imperceptible shift in tone, something closer to acceptance than resistance. He looked down at his hands, turning them slightly as if noticing them for the first time, the subtle tremor in his fingers now gone, replaced with stillness. I used to think that was just something people said. He continued, his voice steady but low. Something comforting. Something that sounded good in the moment. He paused, then shook his head slightly, almost to himself. But this, his voice trailed off again, not because he did not have words, but because none of them seemed enough. The room held that unfinished sentence without pressing for more, the quiet, stretching comfortably around it. Amara shifted slightly in her seat, not to break the moment, but to settle into it more fully, her presence grounded, patient. Some things are not meant to be explained, she said after a while, her tone gentle, not definitive, but offered. Daniel looked up at her again, his gaze clearer now, less guarded, as if something in him had loosened just enough to allow the possibility of that idea. He did not respond immediately, but there was no dismissal in his silence, no rejection, only consideration. The morning light had grown stronger, filling the room with a soft brightness that touched everything evenly, and Daniel noticed how different it felt now compared to the night before, how the same space could hold such a different weight. He pushed himself up slowly from the chair, not abruptly, not with urgency, but with intention, and took a few steps toward the window, his reflection faintly visible in the glass. He stood there for a moment, looking out without really focusing on anything beyond it, his mind still moving through what he had just experienced. Then, almost without thinking, he spoke again. My wife used to volunteer at a children's hospital, he said, his voice quieter, more distant, as if the memory was unfolding in front of him rather than being recalled. She spent hours there, sometimes entire days. He paused, his gaze lowering slightly. She said the children there needed more than medicine. Amara listened closely, her posture unchanged, her attention steady, sensing that this was not just a story, but something important beginning to surface. Daniel turned slightly, his eyes shifting back toward her, something new in his expression now, something that had not been there before. You said your grandmother taught you that song, he said slowly, the words measured, deliberate. Where did she learn it? Amara held his gaze for a moment, not avoiding the question, but not rushing to answer it either, as if she understood that whatever she said next would carry more weight than it seemed on the surface. Her fingers moved slightly against her lap, a small, unconscious motion, before she spoke. She never told me exactly, she said gently, only that she learned it when she was young. She used to say it came from a place where people needed comfort more than anything else. Daniel's brow tightened just slightly, not in doubt, but in focus, as if the words had aligned with something already forming in his mind. A place like a hospital, he said quietly, almost to himself. Amara gave a small nod. Maybe, she replied. She worked in one for a while when I was little, cleaning rooms, helping wherever she could. She said the children there were always afraid at night. The air in the room shifted again, subtle but undeniable, as the pieces began to move closer together, not fully connected, but no longer scattered. Daniel turned his body slightly, facing her more directly now, his posture no longer guarded, but intent, his attention fully anchored in the moment. Do you remember which hospital? He asked, his voice calm, but carrying a quiet urgency beneath it. Amara thought for a second, her gaze drifting slightly as she searched her memory, then she looked back at him. St. Mary's, she said. It was a small place. Not there anymore, I think. They closed it years ago. Daniel's breath caught, not sharply this time, but enough to be felt, enough to slow everything down for a second. He turned his head toward the window again, but he was no longer seeing the morning light or the street beyond it. He was somewhere else now, somewhere years behind him, standing in a hallway that smelled faintly of antiseptic and something softer beneath it, something human. She volunteered there, he said, his voice quieter now, almost distant. Every weekend. She used to come home and tell me about the kids, how some of them would not sleep unless someone stayed with them. He paused, his jaw tightening just a little. She said they did not need much, just someone to sit there, to talk, to sing. The last word lingered in the air longer than the others, as if it had been waiting to be said. Amara did not interrupt, but her eyes softened, her understanding deepening without needing further explanation. Daniel let out a slow breath, his hand lifting briefly to his forehead before dropping back down to his side, a small gesture that carried more weight than it seemed. There was one night, he continued, his voice steady but lower, more controlled. as if he was choosing each word carefully. She came home later than usual. Said there was a little girl who would not stop crying, no matter what they did. He glanced at Amara again, his gaze sharper now, more focused. She stayed there for hours, just sitting beside her, singing. The room fell quiet again, but it was no longer the same kind of silence as before. It was heavier now, more deliberate, like something important was about to surface. Amara's lips parted slightly, not in shock, but in recognition, something faint but real flickering behind her eyes. Daniel noticed it immediately. "What is it?" he asked, his voice softer, but direct. Amara hesitated for just a second, then spoke carefully. "My grandmother used to tell me about a woman," she said slowly. "A woman who would come in on weekends. Not staff, not family, just someone who showed up." Daniel's breath stilled again, the space between them narrowing without either of them moving. "What did she say about her?" he asked quietly. Amara's gaze held his, steady, certain now. "She said that woman had a voice that made children forget they were afraid." Daniel did not move when she finished speaking, not immediately, as if the words needed time to settle into something real, something undeniable, and for a moment, the room felt smaller, quieter, like the space between past and present had narrowed to almost nothing. His gaze stayed on Amara, but it was no longer searching in the same way, no longer trying to question or verify, but holding on to something that had finally begun to take shape. "Her name was Evelyn," he said slowly, the name leaving his lips with a softness that carried both familiarity and distance, as if he had not said it out loud in a very long time. Amara listened, her expression steady, her posture unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in her eyes, a deeper attention, as if she understood that this was not just a continuation of the conversation, but something more personal, something that mattered. Daniel took a slow breath, his chest rising and falling evenly now, his voice quieter but clearer. "Evelyn Whitmore," he continued. "She believed that people did not need permission to care. She said if you could help, even a little, then you should." He paused briefly, his eyes lowering as if he could see her again in that memory, standing in a hallway that no longer existed, surrounded by children whose names he had never learned. "I used to think she was giving too much of herself away," he admitted, a faint tension returning to his jaw, though it was softer now, less defensive. "I told her she could not fix everything, that it was not her responsibility." The words lingered, heavy with something unspoken, something that had not been resolved. Amara remained still, allowing the silence to carry the weight of that admission without interrupting it. Daniel let out a quiet breath, the kind that carried more than air, and lifted his gaze again, this time not to the window, not to the room, but directly to her. "She did not argue," he said. "She just smiled and said, 'I am not trying to fix everything. I am just trying to make one moment easier.'" The sentence hung between them, simple and complete, and for a second, it felt like Evelyn herself had stepped into the room through those words. Amara's lips parted slightly, not in surprise, but in recognition, as if she had heard something like that before, somewhere distant but familiar. Daniel watched her closely now, not with suspicion, but with a quiet intensity, connecting something he had not fully understood until this moment. "Your grandmother," he said slowly, the words deliberate. "She worked there at the same time." It was not a question. It was something closer to realization. Amara nodded once, her expression calm, but there was something deeper beneath it now, something that mirrored the weight in his voice. "She did," she said softly. "She used to talk about those nights. About the children who were afraid to sleep. About the woman who stayed when everyone else went home." Daniel's breath caught again, but this time it did not feel like shock. It felt like something aligning, something falling into place that had been scattered for too long. He took a step closer, not abruptly, but with intention, his presence no longer distant, no longer held back by the same barriers that had defined him before. "And the song," he said, his voice almost a whisper now, "she learned it there." Amara held his gaze, steady, certain, and then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "She said the woman taught it to anyone who would listen," she replied. "So the children would always have someone who knew how to help them feel safe." The room fell quiet again, but this time it was not filled with questions or uncertainty. It was filled with something else, something warmer, something that carried a quiet kind of understanding. Daniel stood there for a moment, his shoulders no longer tense, his expression no longer guarded, and for the first time since the conversation began, there was no resistance left in his eyes, only a quiet acceptance of what had just been revealed, and the realization that the voice he had heard the night before was not an echo, not an imitation, but something that had been passed down, carried forward, and somehow, against all logic, had found its way back to him when he needed it most. Daniel lowered himself slowly into the chair again, as if the weight of what he had just understood required him to sit, his movements deliberate but no longer rigid, no longer controlled in the same guarded way as before. His hands rested on his knees, fingers slightly spread, grounding himself in something physical as his mind continued to move through the connection that had just revealed itself. "She never told me she taught anyone," he said quietly, more to himself than to Amara, his voice carrying a faint trace of something like disbelief, though it was softer now, less resistant. Amara remained where she was, her posture steady, her presence unchanged, but there was a quiet warmth in her expression, something that reflected back what he was beginning to see. "Maybe she did not think of it that way," she said gently. "Maybe she just shared it." Daniel let out a slow breath, the corners of his mouth shifting slightly, not quite a smile, but something close, something that had not appeared in a long time. He leaned forward a little, his elbows resting on his thighs, his gaze dropping to the floor for a moment before lifting again. "I spent so much time trying to manage everything after she was gone," he said, his voice steady but lower now, more open, as if the words were no longer being filtered through the same layer of control. "Schedules, routines, people coming in and out of this house. I thought if I could keep everything in order, then maybe," his voice trailed off, the rest of the thought unnecessary, already understood. Amara listened without interruption, her eyes steady, her attention fully present, offering space instead of solutions. Daniel shook his head slightly, a quiet acknowledgement of something he could now see more clearly. "But I never thought about what she would have done," he continued. "Not really. I was trying to replace structure, not what she gave." The distinction settled between them, simple but profound, and for a moment, Daniel just sat with it, allowing it to exist without pushing it away. The house around them remained still, but it no longer felt like something to control, something to manage. It felt like a place again, something lived in, something that could hold more than silence. Daniel lifted his gaze to Amara once more, and this time, there was no distance left in it, no barrier of role or expectation. "Last night," he said slowly, "when I heard you through the monitor, I thought it was a mistake. I thought you were trying to imitate something you did not understand." He paused, his jaw tightening briefly, not in anger, but in recognition of his own assumption. "I was wrong." The words came out simply, without defense, without explanation, and they carried more weight because of that. Amara did not react dramatically, did not shift or speak immediately, but there was a subtle change in the way she held his gaze, a quiet acknowledgement that she had heard not just the words, but what stood behind them. Daniel exhaled again, slower this time, his shoulders lowering just a fraction more, as if something he had been holding for a long time had finally been set down. "You did not just calm her," he added, his voice softer now, almost reflective. "You gave her something I could not." The admission lingered, not heavy, but honest, and for a moment, neither of them felt the need to fill the space that followed. Then Daniel shifted slightly in his seat, his posture more relaxed than it had been since the beginning, and he looked toward the hallway that led to the nursery, where Lily was still sleeping, her presence now felt even in her absence. "I do not want to lose that," he said quietly, not looking at Amara as he spoke, but not hiding the meaning either. "Not again." He turned his head back toward her, his expression steady, grounded in something new, something more certain. "Stay," he said, the word simple, but carrying a depth that went beyond employment, beyond arrangement. "Not just for the job." He paused, then added, softer, but clearer, "for her. And for this." Amara did not answer right away, and the quiet that followed his request did not feel uncertain, but careful, as if she understood that what he had just offered carried more than a simple decision, more than a position or a role within the house. Her eyes remained on his, steady and calm, but there was a shift beneath that calm, something thoughtful, something weighing not just his words, but everything that had led to them. She drew in a slow breath, her shoulders rising slightly before settling again, her hands resting loosely together as she considered what to say. "I am here for her," she said softly at first, her voice gentle but clear, and Daniel nodded faintly, as if he expected that answer, as if it aligned with something he already knew about her. But she did not stop there. "And I am here because this place needs more than quiet," she continued, her gaze steady, not confrontational, but honest in a way that did not ask for permission. Daniel's expression shifted slightly, not in resistance, but in recognition, as if he could feel the truth in her words before fully processing them. Amara glanced briefly toward the hallway that led to the nursery, her attention pulled for just a second by the presence of the child who had unknowingly brought them to this moment. Then she looked back at him. "She is not the only one who needed that song last night," she added quietly. The words settled gently, but they carried weight, not heavy or accusatory, but undeniable, and Daniel felt them land somewhere deeper than anything else that had been said so far. He did not respond immediately, his gaze lowering slightly as he absorbed what she meant, not as a challenge, but as an observation, something offered without judgment. He exhaled slowly, his shoulders dropping just a fraction more, the last remnants of that rigid control softening into something more human, more open. "I know," he said after a moment, his voice quiet, not defensive, not distant, but grounded in a kind of acceptance that had been building since the night before. He looked up again, meeting her eyes fully now, without hesitation. "I felt it," he added, the admission simple, but significant as if. It marked a line he had not crossed before. Amara's expression softened slightly, not in relief, but in understanding, as if she had been waiting not for him to agree, but for him to recognize it himself. The room remained still, the morning light now fully settled across the floor, warming the space in a way that felt different from the night before, less fragile, more certain. Daniel shifted forward in his seat, his posture no longer guarded, his movements unforced, and for the first time, there was a sense of ease in the way he occupied the room. "You said your grandmother worked in those rooms," he said slowly, his tone reflective, connecting the threads again, not out of doubt, but out of clarity. "She stayed with children who were afraid." Amara nodded once, her gaze steady. "She did," she replied. Daniel held that for a moment, then gave a small nod of his own, as if something inside him had settled into place. "Then I think she would understand why you are here," he said quietly. Amara did not smile, not fully, but there was a warmth that reached her eyes, a quiet acknowledgement that needed no words. Daniel stood up slowly, not abruptly, not with urgency, but with a calm intention that had not been there before, and he took a step toward the hallway, then paused, turning back to her. "You can stay," he said again, but this time the words carried something different, not a request, not even an offer, but a recognition. "Not because I need help," he added, his voice steady, "but because this house needs what you bring into it." He let the sentence settle, not filling the space after it, not explaining further, because it did not need explanation. Amara rose to her feet as well, her movement quiet, grounded, and for a moment, they stood there in the same space, not separated by roles or expectations, but connected by something simpler, something more human. From down the hallway, a faint sound stirred, not a cry, not urgent, just the soft movement of a child waking slowly from sleep, and both of them turned their attention toward it at the same time, not out of duty, but instinct, their steps naturally aligning as they moved in that direction together, the distance between them no longer defined by who they were before, but by what they had just chosen to carry forward. The nursery door opened softly, barely making a sound as Daniel pushed it inward, and the light inside was warmer now, fuller, the pale morning glow mixing with the gentle yellow of the night lamp that had never been turned off. Lily stirred in her crib, her small movements slow and untroubled, a quiet stretch of her fingers, a soft shift beneath the blanket, the kind of waking that did not carry fear, did not break the calm that had settled over her. Daniel stepped closer first, but not with urgency, not with the tight control that had once defined every step he took toward that crib, but with something quieter, something more present. He rested his hand lightly on the edge of the crib, watching her for a moment, his expression softer than it had been in a long time. The lines on his face no longer pulled tight by exhaustion or frustration, but eased by something he was only beginning to understand. Amara moved beside him without needing to be asked, her presence steady, her steps light, and when Lily let out a small, sleepy sound, it was Amara who leaned in first, her hand gently brushing along the baby's back, not to silence her, not to control the moment, but simply to be there. Daniel watched that gesture closely, not analyzing it, not measuring it, but absorbing it, the simplicity of it, the quiet certainty behind it. "Good morning, little one," Amara whispered, her voice barely above the air itself, and Lily's tiny hand shifted, curling slightly as if reaching for something familiar. Daniel felt it then, not as a sudden realization, but as something steady and undeniable, settling into place without resistance. He reached in slowly, his fingers brushing lightly against Lily's hand, and for a second, she responded, her grip small but present, her touch grounding him in a way that no plan or structure ever had. The room remained quiet, but it was no longer the kind of silence that echoed. It was full now, held together by small movements, soft breaths, and the quiet rhythm of three people sharing the same space, without tension. Amara began to hum again, not the full song this time, just a gentle thread of melody, something light, something that did not demand attention, but filled the air, in a way that felt natural, effortless. Daniel did not step back. He did not interrupt. He stayed where he was, his hand still resting near Lily's, his breathing steady, his presence no longer distant from the moment unfolding in front of him. The sound moved through the room again, softer than before, but just as real, just as grounding, and this time, Daniel did not feel the need to question it, to trace it back, or to understand where it came from. He simply let it be. The morning light shifted slightly, brushing across the crib, catching the curve of Lily's cheek, the softness of her closed eyes, and for a brief second, everything felt still in the most complete way, not paused, not frozen, but whole. Daniel glanced at Amara, not with uncertainty, not with hesitation, but with a quiet acknowledgement, something unspoken but understood, and she met that look without changing her expression, her calm steady, her presence unchanged. There was nothing dramatic in the moment, nothing loud or overwhelming, just a quiet continuation, something carried forward without effort. Lily's breathing remained even, her small hand still lightly holding onto his finger, and Daniel did not pull away. He stayed there, grounded in that connection, in that simple, human moment that required nothing more than presence. The house, once heavy with absence, now held something else, something softer, something alive, and it did not announce itself, did not demand recognition. It simply existed, in the light, in the silence, in the space between them. And as Amara's quiet humming blended into the morning, Daniel understood something he had missed for far too long, not as a thought, not as a conclusion, but as a feeling that settled deep within him, steady and